Okay, now we're live. Okay. Well, before we begin, let's go ahead and start in prayer. I usually ask somebody if they'd like to volunteer to open us up in prayer, since I'm going to be doing a lot of talking, or jawing. Would somebody like to open us up in prayer? Jason would? Thanks, Bob.
Heavenly Father, Lord, again, we thank you for this time, Lord. We just before that, we feel like we didn't know what you felt about you, Lord. We just thank you for this, Lord. Lord, I just pray for chance out again, Lord, as we do this, Lord. And I just pray that you just lead the way that will just change our hearts and minds and just everything about you. In Jesus' mighty precious name, Lord.
Amen. Thank you. Hand back on it for a little. Okay. Well, again, this is a discussion class. Just feel free to throw up your hand, and we'll talk about it. That's what we're here for. And that makes it fun, because I know that you guys have quite a bit of knowledge and understanding of Scripture. I know that I don't know it all, and I like to learn from you guys too. So it's kind of a give and take kind of class, iron sharpening iron, kind of how I see it. When we did the book of Jude, we talked a little bit how the book of Jude itself was disputed by the early church fathers. A lot of it had to do with the fact because the watchers were mentioned in there, and they quoted from the book of Enoch, which talked about the watchers. Well, we're going to also get into another much disputed book, which of course is the book of Genesis, and it's disputed not just within the church but also outside the church. A lot of it has to do with authorship, interpretation, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to get into that, but we're going to look at three main areas: contentions over the creation account, the interpretation of the book, and the authorship of the book. So we're going to get into that. I sent out that email. Did you guys get a chance to read through some of that? Okay. That was a summary of a book that I had done for a Bible study class a while back, and we're going to get into some of those quotes. I put up some of those quotes here because they're important, I think, at least when discussing this issue of creation versus evolution, because a lot of people feel that evolution is a fact. Even within the church, some people feel that it's a fact and that's an unwavering fact, but we're going to get into some of that, about that. But there are two primary worldviews on the origins of the universe. The first one is, of course, we were created. That kind of falls under the area of creationism. Another area that falls under that atheists or evolutionists like to mockingly call creation light is intelligent design. And it's a newer movement that's kind of been growing for a number of years now, and it has a lot to do with the issue that it's because all the problems of evolution are coming up and they're being talked about, and now they're being talked about in the higher institutions. Actually, they've always been talked about in the scientific peer-reviewed journals, if you read them. They never really kind of made it out to the college classes and into the high school classes, but they talked about these problems for a number of years in the peer-reviewed journals. And if you watch that movie, it was with the Ben Stein, No Intelligence Allowed. Yeah, he talked a lot about this part of the movement. It's folks who are realizing that the theory of evolution is not holding up as they hoped it would, or as Darwin hoped it would. And so there is a branch of science that's growing up. They call it intelligent design. But the hardcore atheists and evolutionists, they think that it's an in-run around by the Christians to get into the science community. They see that creationism is just one far extreme. That's why they call this intelligent design and creation light, is an attempt to get in. But it's really, the scientists are following the path of the evidence. There was one guy, his name was Anthony Flew. He was a well-known atheist. He used to debate Christians and creationists at universities and college campuses all over the place. And a couple of years ago, he changed his position from an atheist to a theist. And he was doing an interview with, I can't remember the doctor's name, there's a professor at Liberty University. And he just said he basically just followed the facts where they led. And that was just, it was a major disruption in the atheist community. Of course, they now say he's just an old man who's become weak and feeble and he's losing his mind. Before that, he was extremely intelligent. He was a flagship carrier. He was the man. But now, of course, he's all messed up and falling apart. So, but of course, I put here in the beginning, God. The other side is that we evolved out of chaos.
or we came out of a big birth, which is what evolutionism falls under. Harlow Shapley said in the beginning hydrogen, he was mocking Christians. The creationist Dr. Kent Hovind said in the beginning birth.
So it's one of two things. In the beginning, there was a simple element that came out of accident, which actually they say came from nothing, or there was intelligent design. There's basically those two basic broad views. There's actually a third, and it's a mix of the two.
And many of the world religions actually share a mixture between
with creationism and evolutionism, kind of combined together. But those two are kind of the broad categories, I guess, like the bookends, if you want to look at it that way. They're kind of the bookends, and then in between is a mix of the two. And Christianity, within Christianity, have a mix of the two. Yes?
Yeah, I've heard some from the Catholic side of the things. Say that, yeah, God created it, and then he let it evolve.
Yeah. Yeah, the Pope...
That's kind of how they get around that.
Yeah, Pope John Paul, before he passed away, he had said that we have no contention with Darwinism or evolutionism from a church position. And he actually recently came out and said they have no problems with space aliens. So they're kind of absorbing a lot of the worldly ideals. And they actually, one Catholic theologian had said that, he says, more than likely our space brothers are without sin, and they can actually teach us how to live without sin. So that was an interesting position to come out from the Catholic Church. But yeah, there is a lot of this taking in of the ideas of evolutionism and some other philosophies into a Christian worldview. And a lot of it is because they believe that the evidence is overwhelming. So therefore, rather than standing our ground and not absorbing the facts, we need to somehow find a position where we can marry the two. The problem is, though, I don't think we need to marry the two, and we'll get into that a little bit. Some basic questions that actually shape our worldview is, and these are typical questions that we kind of all ask ourselves, is who am I, where did I come from, why am I here, and where am I going when I die? A biblical worldview, who am I? We're the objects of God's grace and mercy. Of course, from an evolutionary point of view, we really have no importance. No one's important. Even in the textbooks, they'll tell you, you're really no different than a fruit fly. I think even a fir tree has more chromosomes than we do, so maybe the fir tree is more advanced than we are. So from an evolutionary point of view, we're really not that important. We're here by a complete accident. It just so happened that, through the inherent properties of space, matter, and time, we just happened to come here. But that's the evolutionist point of view. From a biblical point of view, we're the object of God's grace and mercy. There's a purpose for us being here.
So really, the politicians who believe in the evolution, you didn't get that message about no one's important.
No. Well, to them, you're a vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're one vote. So you have some importance, but that's about it. Where did I come from? Of course, we're made in the image of God. From an evolutionary point of view, you came from a molecule. Well, you came from a monkey. Before that, you were a slug or something else. Then you were an amoeba. Then you were various kind of protein. Then you were just a rock, is where you came from. Eventually, you went from inanimate to animate. So you're really not much of anything. Why am I here? Of course, to be saved by grace through faith and to glorify God. Why are you here by random chance again? Where am I going when I die? Heaven or hell, depending upon the choices you make in this life. If you're an evolutionist, you just go back to the dirt. You're just worm food. And of course, this is, and I think I've told you this before, this is my brother's point of view. Of course, we're the two extremes in one family, so, yeah.
Well, I mean, the Bible does say, come to us, we came to us, we go, but our soul will on. Yeah. That's what my brother feels, and that's what a lot of people do, is you just go back to work, and that's it, there's nothing else.
So, yeah.
This is a kind of cool concept I was listening to last night. So, but if you take a CD, you go back to CD with ton of data where you can't put any more on it. He said, you know, you take the CD and it weighs, I don't know how many grams or something. And then, so after you load the data on there and you load it again, does it weigh any more or less? He said it weighs the same. And he said I mean, he was extrapolating that software doesn't weigh anything.
Yeah.
And in effect, our soul is a software.
Yeah.
And that we transcend in our soul, we transcend space-time, what we call space-time.
Yeah.
Einstein's theory of relativity, in 1915. And then he said that we. It was interesting to him because he said if that's true, then you don't have any the same laws of the physical universe do not apply.
Yeah.
To something that weighs nothing. It's just there.
Yeah.
You know, and he said that's kind of interesting because, you know, with DNA and everything and how that proves.
Yeah.
He really got up on the about it. I just think that it was really interesting, the concept that the software, you can have a huge amount of software. Weighs nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's information. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, information, that's what we'll talk a little bit about with DNA. Information has no mass. And that's one of the greatest discoveries of the DNA molecule, is that it's information. And information cannot arise from matter. It has to have an intelligence. There has to be an intelligent source to create information. It just doesn't come about from nothing. And that's a good point. And one of the things he had said, he had a computer that he said, he goes, I've got all my programs on this computer, and it's an older computer. When I transferred them over to a new computer, it ran much faster. Same programs, but it ran much faster. And he said, of course, you know, we live in these bodies. There's come a day when we'll have, instead of flesh and bone, or flesh and blood, it'll be flesh and bone, it'll be brand new bodies. He says, we're coming for one heck of an upgrade. So that's one of the ways he put it, you know. Yeah. We still have these personalities. We're still this person, but we're coming for one heck of an upgrade. We'll have a body like that of Christ, and of course, He still got to eat. Yay! So that's what I'm looking forward to. Anyway, some common questions that always come up when you study the book of Genesis. Like I said, it's a very disputed book. The first area, of course, always deals with creation. Was it really created in 6 days? What do the Hebrew scholars say? What do the experts of the Hebrews say? What's their opinion? Was it 6 days? Was it many days? Was it eons of time? Was there time before the 6 days of creation? We'll get into that. Were the days of creation simply long periods of time? That's what some people feel, that they were just eons of time. Did people really live for hundreds of years? If you take a look at the scriptures, these guys lived for 800, 900 years. And some people say, no, that's not really how long they lived. They didn't live that long. It had to do with the crop cycles. They counted their years based upon the cycles of the crops. And if they had 3 or 4 cycles of crops in a year, that's what they counted. That'd be 4 years. So it's like, okay, well, but we'll take a look at that. Was the flood of Noah worldwide or just a local flood? And there are some Christians who believe it was just a local flood. It was just in a certain region. And one of the reasons why they bring that up is they make the point, and this is true, there's not enough water on the earth to cover the highest mountains. The issue, of course, is, were the mountains always that high? If you go on top of the Himalayas, you'll find clamshells that are in a closed position. Clamshells, when they die, it's a muscle, it'll open. It relaxes, it'll die. But if it closes, if it's fossilized in a closed position, that means it was buried alive. So that sediment formed around it and kept it closed. Because normally when they die, they just open, the muscle gets eaten, and then all you just have is the shell halves. But they found a lot of closed mollusk shells on top of Mount St. Helens, and it looks like the sea floor. So apparently the sea floor was actually pushed up. So there's this issue: was it worldwide or was it local? Well, we'll get into that. Yes.
We found clam shells up in the hills in California.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's good as a water, it's so
Yeah.
it's a high, it's good as a water.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they find massive graveyards all over the place, and a lot of them look like they're in large eddies, where like water was swirling and they got caught in the eddy and then just kind of bunched up together, and massive like dinosaurs, things that lived on the land and also things that lived on the sea. So there's a lot of really good stuff. What was the other question? Did God use evolution to bring about man? And again, there are some people who say that yes, God did use evolution to bring about man. Because, well, we'll get into it. I don't want to give too much away here. Just bringing up some of the questions. Is the earth millions or billions of years old? And this is one of the things that, if you know the ministry Answers in Genesis, they discuss this quite a bit. And this has actually been kind of one of the last holdouts that evolutionists have used against creationists, because they've had to kind of give up the fossil record, because once you understand the fossil record, it's actually better evidence for a worldwide flood than it is for, and I'll bring up some of those quotes, it's actually better evidence for a worldwide flood than it is for an evolved species or the geologic column. There's a lot of other areas that they kind of had to back away from because the evidence was too overwhelming, but this is one of the regions that they still kind of dominate in, but there's actually a good explanation for that, and we'll probably eventually get into that. But doesn't science contradict the Bible? That's one of the things that I had thought growing up. I love math and science. I went off to Rose Holland to become a mechanical engineer, and I wanted to do for aeronautical technology. I just love math and science. And everything that I had studied in high school and in college, there was always this understanding that you can believe in the Bible all you want to, but science says different. So I thought, and there was a long period of time where I just stayed away from trying to reconcile the two. But when I finally had my daughter and I started to feel like the Lord was saying, okay, either get off the fence or do something here, that's when I started questioning God, and then God was kind to me like he was to Thomas and gave me the answer. Like I said in my email, it took about 8 years worth of study. So, but he was patient with me. It's not going to take 8 years to do this stuff. So. Unless you want it to be.
How long did you remember?
120 years, I think it was.
And how many converts did you get?
He got 8. No, 7. That's about it. Yeah. So, yeah, that's true. There are two main areas of science there's two main areas of science, and one of the reasons why people say, doesn't science contradict the Bible? And I actually went to the debate I had with the non-theist on Facebook with my wife's account. He had said that if we were to follow you creationists, we would have no more advancements in medicine, no more advancements in any kind of engineering, architecture, any science, any medicine, whatever, pharmaceutical. And I didn't get a chance to tell him because we were writing about something else. But there's two areas here. One of them is observational sciences and the other is historical sciences. Observational science deals with things that are repeatable, testable, and you can experiment on, basically with the 5 senses. Out of that area of science comes medicine, computers, cars, rockets, spaceships, all that kind of stuff. That's stuff that we can test in the here and now. We can do repeated experimental tests, kind of like what we do at Cummins. We can put an engine into a test cell. We can run experiments on the engine, on that part, on that fuel filter, on that control system, whatever. It has nothing to do with evolution. Evolution has nothing to do with it. But the area in which evolution falls under is historical sciences. And basically, it's present observable processes are used to extrapolate and interpret historical events. And like it says in Job 38:4, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. We can't go back into the past. The evolutionists can't go back into the past. We can't go back into the past. None of us can go back into the past. Now we can read about what happened in the past, according to Scripture, but we can't go back. So we cannot go back into the past and test things in the past. We can't look at what life was like back then. We can take a look at fossils. We can take a look at vegetation mats, coal mats or coal seams. We can do experiments on present substances, but we cannot physically go back into the past. it's not possible yet. Maybe they'll come up with that someday in time travel, and we'll go back. No, I don't think so. But we can't do that. So all that falls under historical sciences, and the best we can do is look at the present state of our world and try to extrapolate backwards. We can look at present processes that take place today and try to determine if that's what took place in the past. For example, I don't have it up there. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself.
But creationism and evolutionism are in the realm of science.
Both are actually a religious world viewpoint. And even if you know Answers in Genesis Ministry, they're the ministry that has the Creation Museum down in Kentucky, I think it is, just across the river. They'll say that creationism is a religious viewpoint, but so is evolutionism. And both have to be accepted by faith. Now, you can have a great deal of evidence, a large body of evidence that can support that viewpoint, but in the end, it's a faith position, whether you're looking at creationism or evolutionism. And the reason why I say evolutionism is a religion, there was a physicist, British physicist, H.S. Lipson. He expressed the following. He said, evolution became, in a sense, a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it, and many are prepared to bend their observations to fit with it. To my mind, the theory of evolution does not stand up at all. And
One of the supporters of Darwinism, I think he called him Darwin's bulldog, was T.H. Huxley.
And he said that evolution, the theory of evolution, was not so much a scientific movement as it was a philosophical movement. And it was a philosophical movement in the sense that it gave people the ability, or the evidence, to back up a worldview where they didn't have to believe in a God. And so therefore, if there was no God, there were no consequences in their actions. And so it basically was a liberating movement for them. They felt like they could throw off the shackles of religion, of Christianity, of having to submit to a God, and they had something to back up that ideological worldview. And so evolution did have and atheism had a good heyday for a long time, but as more evidence begins to accumulate, there's even a book called The Twilight of Atheism that talks about how atheism is starting to go downhill. There's not as many people that support it as once did. The interesting thing, though, is there's a movement towards paganism. There's not necessarily a movement towards Christianity. There's a movement more towards a paganistic worldview, a mystic worldview. So I even had a debate with somebody who was one of my theology classes. And we were talking about the twilight of atheism. He says, so you say that because of that, everybody's going to run into Christianity? I was like, no. No, just because they can't deny God in that field, they'll find another realm to deny God, or at least find a God that will fit their worldview. Yeah, more fun guy. Yeah, they're definitely. Yes.
Do you believe there's a God?
Yeah. Oh, the guy I was talking to? Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the guys I was talking to, he had said, even if you could show me proof for a God, I wouldn't believe him. That's what he said the difference was between an atheist and a non-theist. An atheist, you can show him evidence and he may believe, but a non-theist, even if you showed him evidence, he wouldn't believe at all. So, I think, okay.
I have one of those.
What's that? Oh, really? Oh, well, good.
She's on Facebook, and one of her favorite, one of her favorite things is to
Oh,
theological things.
she likes to beat people into debates. Okay.
She has a lot of Christian people that on her Facebook, more people that she doesn't know.
Huh.
But it's interesting to see her out further for her arguments.
Yeah.
And there was time when she was very serious about her viewpoints. But as of probably the last 3 or 4 years, in private conversations between them, you can see her bringing like Harvey faults that she didn't build. While you're sleeping in 17 holding.
Yeah.
Time will take those things
Yeah. I actually like talking to him, but it does get heated at times when we talk. Yeah. 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 There usually, at least I've noticed, there tends to be some standard questions they'll ask that a lot of Christians aren't prepared to answer. And then once we kind of get past some of those, then we start getting to the other things. It's interesting that one of the things that Answers in Genesis Ministry points out is that the atheists, what they do is they attack the foundations of our scriptures, which is starting with the book of Genesis. And the tactic that I've taken is I attack their foundations. And that paper that I wrote for you guys, I've used several times when talking to other atheists, is bringing up all the problems with evolution. Because it's interesting, even though an atheist takes the position that evolution is true, I found that they don't understand evolution as much as they think they do. They feel that it's a very hard, reliable, factual theory. And actually, they don't think it's a theory, they think it's a law. But when you begin to show the problems with the theory of evolution, and we're going to get into some of that, then they'll start to admit to you that, no, they don't know, no, they're not absolutely sure, and then they change it from position of an atheist to an agnostic, which means, gnosis means knowledge. Stick A in front of anything, it means the opposite, so they're without knowledge. So, I don't try to belittle them, I'm trying to help them, I'm trying to lead them to Christ. But I've noticed that I can't start out with the Bible. Because they just don't believe it. They think it's a book that was written by a bunch of men who were trying to control the masses. So I start out with their foundation and show that their foundation is not that strong. It's more like a sinking sand. And when you get past that, then they're actually willing to talk. It seems like a front starts to come down. At least I've noticed that with the few people that I've had a chance to talk with. My brother, that's a different person. That's a very different person. Yeah. 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 One tactic that Ray Comfort uses, he's got it in one of his tracts that he uses for witnessing. He'll draw like a circle and he'll put like a sliver of 5% out, a pie, about 5% out of the whole pie. And he'll say, let's say for example that you know 5% of all the knowledge in the universe. Now, obviously there's no way of knowing if you know 5%. But let's just say you have 5% knowledge. Well, out of that 5%, there's another 95% you don't know about. Is it possible that in that 95% there is evidence for God? Because to be an atheist, to say there is no God, that's an absolute statement. That's kind of like saying there is no gold in China. Well, in order to make that kind of statement, you have to know that there's no gold in the ground, there's no gold fillings in the Chinaman's tooth, there's no gold in the jewelry stores. You have to say that's an absolute statement. So to say there is no God, you have to have absolute proof. And he's been able to, on the streets, if you've seen some of his videos where he'll be on the street, they'll switch their position to say, well, I'm not absolutely sure. They'll say, I just, from what I've seen so far, I don't think there's a God. So he kind of shows them that you're not looking hard enough, or you're not looking close enough, or whatever. So, but you can say there is gold in China, and of course, that's a statement where if you can show one piece of evidence, then that's a true statement. Now, of course, the Lord has given us a whole bunch of evidence that at least I've had a chance to see. Maybe we'll talk a lot more about that in the class, but the Lord has overwhelmed me with so much evidence that I just reached a point that I would be a fool to say there is no God. I'd be a fool to say that the God of the Bible is not the true God. So I reached that point. But so anyway, get back on track. Evidence versus interpretation. The battle is not over the evidence. The creationists and the evolutionists have the same set of evidence. We're looking at the same fossils. We're looking at the same geologic column. We're looking at the same Grand Canyon. That's the example I gave you of the Grand Canyon. The evolutionists say it took millions of years of erosion by the Colorado River going through that area. The creationist says it was created by a breach dam in a few hours during the flood of Noah. And that's, if we could ever get into it, I don't know if we would, but if you take a look at the topography of the area of the Grand Canyon, the ridge, I think it's called the Kaibab uplift. It kind of goes up in evolution, or elevation. Oh man, I can't talk. Elevation. Thanks. Elevation. It goes up in elevation, comes down. Well, that river didn't flow uphill and then back down. But what they saw during the Mount St. Helens eruption is there was an area where a lot of mud and logs and rocks got choked in a valley, and it stopped the water for a while, but the water kept building up from that glacier that melted. And as the pressure got so huge, it burst open the dam, and then it created a canyon within less than a half an hour. So we can see.
It's a big canyon.
Yeah, it's a big canyon.
There's a lot of water.
There's a lot of water. Now, of course, during a worldwide flood, that was worldwide water. So again, this is the idea. We can't go back into the past to see what happened during the worldwide flood, but we can look at a current process, a catastrophic process that took place, look to see what it did in a short period of time, and extrapolate that that's possible in the past. And that's what it looks like happened during the worldwide flood. Is that canyon was a breached dam that broke and then carved out that canyon in a second. Because if you ever look at the geologic column, there's no erosion layers there's no erosion between the columns, and a lot of times they'll bend. You ever seen those where the lines will bend? Well, that rock was soft at one time. Well, then over time it hardened, probably because of the lime that was in it, creating almost like a cement. So that's how that formed.
Pretty much flat. So
yeah, and a lot of that was probably pushed up. Of course, the Bible says
the majority of the mountain range indicates either sheep peaks or shears. If one quite under the edge, the other is propped up, and there's various theories on how that massive earth movement took place, but there is evidence that the Rockies were, they may not have been flat, but they were as big as they are now.
Yeah.
So that's in that same general area. There's a lot of geological upheaval that took place at that part of the.
Yeah. And when we get into the Noah's flood, it talks about how the waters were assuaged, and the assuaged means it ran off very quickly. And of course, a lot of the water came from the fountains of the deep, came from underneath the earth. And one of the largest underwater oceans is actually under China. It's several hundred miles down, but it's there. So there's a lot of water still in the crust, but the indication, at least from Scripture, is a lot of the water came from the fountains of the deep. And we'll get into that when we talk about the flood. Yeah.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah. There was a drilling crew, I think they were either in Siberia or Alaska. I can't remember which one it was. But they were drilling several miles down, and they kept pulling up mud. And they kept commenting that we should be hitting rock now. We should not be hitting mud at all at this depth. And they kept wondering, how is it that there's so much mud still all the way down there? Of course, in a worldwide flood, you would have a lot of churning that would take place. But it's just interesting to see how there's little pieces of evidence that keep coming up that feed into the notion there was a worldwide cataclysmic flood, instead of a uniformitarianism view where things happen slowly over time. So anyway, but is an evolution an unwavering fact? Well, if you had a chance to read the report, we're going to cover some of those, and I'm going to read a lot of quotes. These are the kind of quotes that I like whenever I'm debating with atheists. I like to bring these up because most atheists, agnostics, evolutionists, they won't believe what I have to say, but they'll believe what their priestly class will have to say. So, and this was a summary that I had done from a book. It's called What is Creation Science? It's from Henry Morris, and Gary Parker. And I think Henry Morris is the one who's known for beginning or starting the creationist movement back in the 60s or 50s. I can't remember when it was. But just Christians really didn't get into the issue of creationism. It was just kind of an accepted fact. But during the Scopes trial, there was a lot of, even though I think he actually won the trial, that brought up a lot of issues of, well, is this whole thing of creation true? So, but anyway, he kind of helps start the movement. Problems with the fossil record. Darwin said intermediate links. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic change, and this is perhaps the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory of evolution. One of the things that Darwin had hoped would happen is that as geologists and archaeologists and anthropologists, as they began to dig in the dirt and look for this stuff, he had hoped that they would find the interconnecting links that he had hypothesized. But he understood that that could be a problem. And as it's been shown over 120 years, that's a problem. There is a big problem with the fossil record, and there are some scientists who say we should not use it at all.
It's not as popular a term now as it was back when I was growing up, but they don't use the term specifically searching for the missing link.
Yeah.
As you go, you find that term missing link. There's much anymore, but back when I was growing up, science was openly searching for the quote from missing link.
Yeah. And they still, I'm sorry, go ahead.
He spent his lifetime looking for it and he never found it.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't hear that term as much anymore.
No.
They're still searching.
They're still, yeah.
We don't hear the missing link as they used as a term
Yeah.
that much anymore in science.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll talk about that. There were several of those kind that put a big nail in the coffin to the fossil record. Yes.
There was a huge debate recently about the textbooks in Texas and the argument over whether the theory developed the launch concluded.
Yeah, yeah.
They also had some serious issues about the current textbooks leaving out some key parts in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Just as recent as that.
Yeah.
And it's looked like that the intelligent design folks had won a fight on that, on the redesign of the Texas textbook.
Oh, okay.
Debate. And there was a guy who's pretty well fit from the Northeast, lives in St. Petersburg, and we were out on a job together, and he was talking about that. He goes, well, you know about all of those people in Texas and all that, and I go, he goes, no, you don't believe any of that stuff, do you? I go, well, I said, so you believe in evolution? You know,
Yeah.
well, yeah, that's the law of evolution. You know, so that's how the theory of evolution evolved to the law of evolution.
Yeah.
In word speech, and
I said, well, sure. I said, you feel there can't be an explosion, haven't you? And he looked at me. What?
Huh?
What's that?
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
so yeah, that's the point. In
You know, I mean, broke it through all of the life, that we see in the fossil record. No matter where you go and what depth in the world, it happened at the same time.
Yeah. Some event happened at the same
Yeah.
time. That's
So what
interesting.
happened?
Yes.
The reason this textbook in Texas is so important, people clear across the country use no standard.
Yeah.
So all the textbooks coming out now across the country will have the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. There was Dr. Kent Hovind had helped to start a movement which was along this lines, was truth in textbooks, and he wanted to get certain things taken out of the textbooks that were shown to be false. And there was like the horse evolution theory, and there were several other things that just were false that he was working on to try to get out of the textbooks, and that's kind of what grew out of that movement.
well, the Mr. talks about the Peking man.
He said the most corrupt of the scientists are the head analysis.
Yeah.
Because you've got all these things that
Have shown, to be
this man, this Cro-Magnon man, Peking man, and it shows exactly where they were discovered as being, contrived.
Yeah.
So they make up
evidence to
suit.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But moving on here, we got, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Several rebuttal to the evolutionist completely involved with the routine looking.
Yeah.
If that's true, then what are we supposed to
Yeah, they say there was a well, they'll say there was a divergence and that segment of the monkey population didn't evolve, but we did. Yeah, there's always an attempted answer. Stephen M. Stanley in 1979 said the known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphological transition. In layman's terms, it means no fossil evidence has shown a creature in transition. Like you said about the missing links, they still have not found any missing links. And even the missing links they say they found, they've had to recategorize as something else, which means they have fewer so-called missing links than they had before. But like I said before, the fossil record is a better evidence for a worldwide flood. Organic material must be buried in a flowing wet sediment for fossilization to occur. During a red tide, there's a whole bunch of fish and other sea life that die, but they just fall to the bottom, they decay, and they're eaten up. And they don't fossilize. There was a lot of buffalo that were killed out in the Midwest that died on the plains. They weren't, Indians, of course, used every part of them, but some of the Western people moving west, they just took what they needed and left the rest, and they never fossilized. Because out in the sun, bone will deteriorate over time. So in order for fossilization to occur, it has to be buried in heavy, wet sediment. And it has to, the water in the sediment has to have some flow to it. Because the way it works is the organic material decomposes, a piece of the sediment is replaced in there. And Dr. Kent Hovind shows, he's got a picture of a fossilized foot inside a boot. A guy had got caught in a bear trap, and it was out in a muddy region. He got caught in the bear trap, snapped his leg off. They got him out of the woods. They couldn't get his leg or the boot, and it was left there. And somebody found it years later, and it was fossilized inside the boot. And the boot still had the serial number on it. They looked the serial number up, and it was made like in the 60s. So fossilization does not take a long period of time. You just have to have the right conditions. Then it's basically buried under heavy wet sediment. Well, of course, to fossilize on a large scale, a worldwide flood would be a really good thing to do that in. And they've shown in computer models that if you have water covering the entire Earth because of the tides from the moon, it would actually cause a churning effect. It would actually, like a big washer, it would constantly be churning, so you'd have a lot of turnover rate of the sediment. So it would be turning over and settling to the bottom, turning over, settling to the bottom until the continent started to shift. So you get a lot of burial quickly over a short period of time. So problems in the evolutionary mechanism. In October of 1980, the world's leading evolutionists met in Chicago for a conference summarized as follows. The large majority of evolutionists at the Chicago conference agreed that the neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutation selection could no longer be regarded as a scientifically tenable explanation for the origin and the diversity of living things. In other words, things don't evolve by gradual change. And that was Darwin's whole hypothesis. Is what he saw is a true event that takes place, and it's referred to as microevolution or speciation or adaptation. And an animal does have the ability to adapt over periods of time to its environment, and they call it microevolution. What Darwin did is he took that, when he was looking at the finches and the birds and stuff, he extrapolated that to go from one species to another. But all that they're finding now is that the DNA within that organism, it only maintains the species. It doesn't allow it to migrate to another species. And that's what these evolutionists in Chicago in 1980, they had decided, which is, this is all the way back in 1980. I can remember, I was in school in 1980, and the textbooks still talked about Darwinism as being a true thing, that things were done gradually over time. And this is the one thing that frustrated me, was to see that all the way back then, in the scientific peer-reviewed journals, in the conferences, they were all coming together, saying, we don't believe this. This is not working. This is not how it's done. But they left it in the textbooks. And I even saw a debate between Dr. Kent Hovind and another evolutionist. Dr. Hovind was just right down the line, knocking down everything that the evolutionist said. And the evolutionist finally said, he goes, well, then what should we tell the kids? And he said, well, maybe the truth. So, but it's interesting to see that, this is what, this is now 30 years ago, right? Yeah, this is over 30 years ago. They had already said, look, this doesn't work. The idea of what Darwin came up with is not working. The mechanism doesn't happen. Yes?
Which was, when I was a school, it was a little more difficult to sit for the night class. And they through development of herd improvement, selective breeding, for the improvement of the profitability of the raising of livestock.
Mm-hmm.
And to go through that and still get through evolution when they say all these changes happened over time. We could see in the night class that selective breeding to change a single trait took generations.
Yeah.
And we were working with animals, chickens, hogs, which you could run 2 generations a year. In hogs, you could run 1 generation every 18 months in beef, and you could run a generation, you could probably run 3 generations in poultry. And we still thinking that agriculture could not make the changes fast enough to support the change time periods in evolution.
Yeah.
And you still couldn't turn pork into beef.
No, I can't.
When you turn poultry into something else, those leaps, you said in life, you couldn't see how those were supported. When you went to science, you went to science, and you look at the, we're
something's wrong.
that can't be supported.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And there's talking about how long it takes about 15 years to get something that's real textbook to all the people who
Yeah.
People can't, school corporations can't buy books every year, which is a shame. So this Texas model that's coming out is going to be several years down the road for you.
Yeah, and that's the sad part is it takes that long to, of course, yeah.
As well, and what's really sad too is the publisher is in charge of content. So it's not necessarily the scientific community is in charge of what content goes into books. It's the publisher. It's the publisher has the final say of what goes into the book that they publish.
But the publishers will listen to people that buy the books.
And so the change is coming. It's just going to take years to get.
Well, yeah, but if Darwinism was popular for years, so that because it was popular, the publishers listened and they went down that road. They spent a lot of effort going down that road and a lot of money. And we only have a choice. What is the choice? Usually only five different choices when they select textbooks. There's only 5 major publishers and textbooks.
And the township every 4 to 5.
And that's all the publishers that are in the United States are textbooks.
This means the textbooks are wrong.
Yeah. They'll go from a lie to a truth.
But it's what our kids do to fly. And there's only, but I mean, if there's only 4 choices, then because of popular opinion, they're all traveling down the same road. Kids are not going to have a choice for what they want.
I just think having schools for a year go through public schools. And it's just going to take, we're talking several 100,000 kids that are going to be taught wrong.
Yeah, this
Average
is,
lifestyle of the textbook is 4 years.
yeah. Yeah, this is a large ship that doesn't turn on a dime.
When I was in school, my mom and dad used to be, my dad got to choose textbooks every 4 years. So it's 7 now. They choose.
And getting longer because money. They can't afford to buy new textbooks.
So what's being taught to your kids is 7-year-old technology.
Yeah. Well, and that's true from at least what I saw. Yeah.
So you wonder why Darwinism still runs on in school? It's 7, you figure on a 7-year cycle. That's for the changes.
Yeah.
Well, that's teachers try, with when you teach them, a lot of them read Darwin stuff, and then we want the creation stuff.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
because the textbook doesn't mean what we taught.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's because they were taught that.
Exactly.
But anyway, moving on here. we could talk about this forever. Just to mention a few more problems, and we'll get through this here. Problems in genetics. Molecular biologist Dr. Michael Denton refers to the chemical evolution scenario as simply an affront to reason, an insult to the intelligence. Dr. Denton freely admits that many of the scientific views of the early creationists, that's us, have been vindicated by modern discoveries in science. Dr. Denton realizes that the random combining of chemicals in their natural state could not give rise to a complex structure such as the DNA molecule. Another is Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould, who's actually pretty antagonistic towards Christians, believes our knowledge of genetics is now sufficient to completely reject the explanation of evolution as the slow, gradual selection of small mutational changes. He prefers to believe instead that evolution occurs in giant steps, radical restructuring of whole DNA sets producing what he himself calls hopeful monsters. But he admits that no such hopeful monster has ever been observed. His new theory, then, is not of any sort of logical inference from observations, but a fantastic faith in the future of a theory that the facts have failed. There's actually a book, I don't remember the name, but it talks about a hopeful monster, and it's a dinosaur that lays an egg, and out comes a bird. And because, again, it's the evidence is not there to support the gradual change. So like what he's saying here is he's hoping that it's a radical recombination in just one laying of an egg or one birth. So, yeah.
The old theory or the old saying is that this theory of evolution coming together and recombination and all that kind of thing is about as logical as if you have an explosion one night in a printing factory and the next morning you walk in and there was a Bible sitting on the counter, all put together like a dictionary. Let's say Bible, it's a dictionary. The dictionary was on the counter. It was all perfectly done and in order exactly like it's supposed to be.
Yeah, there's a book called Tornado in a Junkyard, and it's based upon a comment one of these guys made. He said, to believe in evolution and this combination of DNA and the changes over time is believing that a tornado can run through a junkyard and assemble a 747. It just doesn't happen. And these are the scientists claiming that it doesn't happen. And like this guy, Stephen Jay Gould, he is known as one of the pioneers of the evolutionary theory, or at least one of the supporters of it. And he's admitting there's no mechanism that shows this happening, but he's hoping. So again, like we said, it's a faith. He's hoping. He has no evidence, but it's a faith that he believes in evolution, and he's hoping that there will be something that will say that this happened. And there's now scientists who are even coming up and saying that, well, evolution didn't take place here. We know that it didn't take place here, but what we believe it took place somewhere else. Of course, that puts the evolution question off on the alien brothers. And there's even some, I'm sorry, but there's even one, this was Dr. Carl Ball in Glen Rose, Texas, the Paluxy River that runs through there. It's a fast-moving river because it drops in elevation quickly. And one day they had a flood that went through there, and it ripped off a whole bunch of the bed of the river, and then they saw prints of dinosaur tracks and human footprints together. And there was even one where a human footprint was in a dinosaur track as they crossed each other. And you can even see the dermal ridges at the time when it came up. You can't see it now because the water's already washed it away. But there was a scientist from the PBC, NPR, no, not. There was one, I think it was public broadcasting station that came out there, and he was an evolutionist, and he would not even look at the footprint until a creationist pointed it out to him, and finally he said, well, that's probably an alien that was here. So, still not accepting that men and dinosaurs were at the same place at the same time, the way the Bible described it. So anyway, I'm sorry, you're first, yeah.
Look, being an Adam and Mormons are really big in genealogy, and so what's the being dedicated about they really could prove everything that Jesus has said, and so they started studying it, and what they found is everything is totally wrong from his theory that we're part of the lost ten tribes, that doesn't really understand it.
The Nephites and the Nemites and the Lamanites and the Danites.
These different species, that one theory is always the same.
Yeah.
And everybody, the ones country on South America, DNA matches with Siberia.
Yeah, they call it the mitochondrial Eve. It's in the mitochondria. Yeah, because it doesn't match up with what they thought. And yeah, like I put here on the last part, DNA is information. And that's the biggest piece of thing that they found with the discovery of the DNA molecule. It's information. It's an encoded software. And it's what helps to determine how we look, how tall we are, how we're shaped, and that kind of thing. And there's a large segment of the DNA they call junk DNA. Because they still say that, well, evolutionary processes, that's just left over. But what they're now discovering, that section of the DNA is not junk DNA. It's a portion of the DNA that helps to govern the other portion of the DNA based upon the environment, based upon your surroundings, your settings. So that's why we have variation within the species. So it's sort of like a software. If you ever work with software like Microsoft Excel, if you really studied all the intricacies of Microsoft Excel, that you can write macros, you can write programs, but I only use a small portion of that program. There's a whole other slew of software in there that I never touch, but until I need it. And that's what they're finding out with the DNA molecule. There's portions of the DNA that kind of sit dormant until they're needed, and they govern the other portion of the DNA. Yes?
Probably give it on a level that each one of us can participate in if you ever decided you wanted to do that. In agriculture, the field corn as we know it today, that yellow kernel that looks like a triangle, if you take, and it's probably one of the most genetically altered and engineered plant that we have on this earth today is corn. And if you take a kernel of what we recognize today as commercially field corn, and you plant it, and you grow it, you harvest the off the ear, you take the kernel and plant it and grow it. It takes, I can't remember whether it's 2 or 3 life cycles. You will eventually get what we commonly know as Indian corn. Because the Indian corn, the multicolored black, brown, green, or black, brown, red, that is the basis of the corn that we know today as hybrid corn. That is the root. But if we have it, everything that we have today is a hybrid, which is a specific male, a specific female. If you take the offspring of that and replant it, you cannot get the original plant that it came from. It will eventually revert back to the Indian corn. And you can do that in your own garden. You can take that kernel, plant it, harvest it, plant it back, in about 2 years or 3 years you will eventually have what they call open pollinated Indian corn.
Yeah.
That basis of that core genetics is there.
Yeah.
And no matter how you play with it, there is a portion of it that they cannot mess with and still have it reproduce.
Yeah, well, that's, of course, and then when we get to that section of the scripture, it says everything produces after its own kind. And so that's what it does. Of course, now, with transhumanism, frankenfoods, genetically modified foods, they're now starting to change that DNA structure. And it's no longer producing after its own kind. They found a gene that they can actually turn off the kernel so it will not produce another corn. So when you plant it, it's a one-time planting. That's Monsanto, if you've ever heard of Monsanto. So.
That's what I'm talking about, the hybrid.
Yeah.
It's one time.
That one's a one time.
You get a kernel of corn, and if you replant it, it will still grow. But it will go back to what it originally was. It will go back to its open pollinated, it looks like Indian corn.
Sorry. Yeah, that's true, yes. Moving on, problems of physical universe. Of course, we've all heard of the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is actually a fairly recent, meaning within the past 50, 60 years. And it's a theory that keeps changing. One of the things, like people have said that, you said, the one guy said, evolution is a law, it's set in stone. Some of the laws of physics we have is the law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, the law of conservation of mass and energy. Those are laws. Those are constants. They don't change. The theory of evolution keeps changing, and the Big Bang Theory is one that has changed continuously. And actually, they do say this in textbooks. First there was nothing, then it exploded. Everything was compressed down into something the size of a dot, and before the dot there was nothing. So nothing produced everything. That's actually in textbooks, kids' textbooks too. I've seen that. But it started out, we had the steady state model, which Einstein said that was his biggest mistake. The hesitation model, refuted in the 60s. Oscillation model, refuted by the laws of entropy. And the inflation model requires anti-gravity forces not observed. So this whole idea that all this stuff is constantly, that they say it's constant, if you study over the history of the sciences, you see that this stuff changes. Because as new evidence comes to light, they have to, the whole idea is you don't hold on to the theory if the facts don't support the theory. You have to throw away the theory or modify the theory. At least some scientists are willing to be truthful and they modify the theory. Of course, the next thing that's coming up is they call it multiverses as opposed to universes. It's interesting that the word universe is just a conjugation of two words, uni and verse, single verse or single spoken sentence. So the cosmos is a single spoken sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, but the idea of multiverses, and the reason why they're coming up with multiverses is because this universe looks too unique to have evolved on its own. But if you're one universe in a sea of trillions upon trillions or quadrillions of universes, then you don't look special. And that's one of the reasons why they're pushing this theory right now. Part of it has to do with dark matter. Dark matter is matter they don't see, but they see an influence upon the solar system from something that they can't see. That's why they call it dark matter. But they say it has something to do with multiverses. Stephen Hawking came out with a book called The Universe in a Nutshell, and he's purporting the idea of a multiverse because it comes down to this universe is just too unique. It's too special. There's even a principle called the anthropic principle, which talks about there's all these dynamics within the universe that seem to appear to be set up just for man here on this little planet. The bond between the strong and weak nuclear bonds of an atom, the gravitational pull upon the celestial objects, our position within the solar system, the position of the sun and the moon and the stars to us, the position in which we sit within the Milky Way. If we were too far inside the Milky Way, we'd be radiated completely because of all the stars, the massive stars in it. So this whole setup looks like it's set up for man. But of course, an evolutionist says that can't be because man's not special. So therefore, this universe is not special. So therefore, there must be multiverses because we look too special. But if we're in trillions and trillions of universes, then we're not special at all. You should expect to find something like this.
It seems like that's a perfect religion for confidence.
Yeah, it is. It's a perfect religion for confidence, yeah. But, and again, hopefully you can kind of see this whole, we're getting close to the end of time here. You can kind of see that this is a religious viewpoint. And it's a bad religious viewpoint because the evidence doesn't stack up for it. And hopefully we'll get into some more evidences for creation to show how the evidence actually is pointing towards that of a creator. And that's why we're seeing this movement of the intelligent design movement growing, because the scientists are going, okay, we can't keep beating our head against the walls and get something different. We got to follow the facts, just like Anthony Flew said, I've got to follow the facts, and he became a theist. Not a Christian yet, but he became a theist. So, any more questions before we close out? We'll stop here. This is a good stopping point. Yeah? All right. Well, thank you guys. Would somebody like to close us out in prayer? Thanks, Bob. I'll volunteer, Bob.
Father, just really thankful that you are in charge, that you have a role in control, that you created it, that you sustain it and provide everything for it. You keep it in the system in which you have designed it. And the overall learning things, the simple things, that all we can about it today, that we create the ability of food we had, whatever we do, all the things that we sometimes look at and find out what it is. Thank you, Lord, for the location here, and
Amen. Thanks, guys. Now let me see if I can stop this recording.